Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple of other verb forms. You don't need to remember all of the terminology, but especially if you're ever asked, I do want you to have an understanding of what's going on with verb forms. And so the one we're going to talk about in this video is the subjunctive form. There are two subjunctive forms, so we're going to start with the first one. So the first subjunctive on its own has kind of two different manifestations. In either case, it is going to be identical to the base form of the verb. Okay, and I'm going to show you what that means. The example your book gives is the phrase be that as it may. Okay, we would not say is that as it may. That does not work, right? That is the correct form. The first one, the second one does not work. Be is the base form of the verb that we use commonly is. So be is just that form, that base form, and we're using it for the subjunctive. Another example of this would be the phrase have at it. I know I've said this quite a bit. I wouldn't say has at it. This means that it does not change in tense. It doesn't change with subject verb agreement. It's also not simply an infinitive, right? It's the base form being used in a very specific way that makes it subjunctive. Oftentimes with subjunctive, it's either expressing kind of something important or like providing emphasis, or it's kind of doing something that like is contrary, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So in terms of the first subjunctive, there are a couple of other things that you should be aware of. You can also use the first subjunctive to indicate urging, requesting, commanding, demanding, or advising. Okay. And I'm going to give you two examples of sentences that I made up in reference to Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses, since that's one of the texts that we've been using. So here's my example. Tamlin demanded that Farah return to Prithian with him. Okay. Here, return is technically the base form of that verb, which makes it a subjunctive. So it's not agreeing with Farah, even though it seems like it is. It is, in fact, the base form, because this is a demand. Another example would be Amarantha, if I can spell. Amarantha, she's kind of the big villain of the first book, required that Rhysand be her lover. Okay. So be, once again, is the base form. It doesn't agree with Rhysand, so that makes it subjunctive. So these are illustrations of the first subjunctive form, which usually, right, expresses something important, and it requires the base form of the verb. The second subjunctive is going to be a little bit different from the first. So the second subjunctive illustrates contrary to fact meanings. Okay. They're often facilitated with what's called an if clause. So the word if with a clear subject and verb tends to be used in these contrary to fact subjunctives. And then finally, it usually will uses were alone, whether singular or plural. Okay. And I will show you what that means in just a second. So here is one illustration using an if clause. If Farah had known who he was, she would have run. Okay. Um, so here, right, um, what we have is the if clause that is providing a contrary to fact meaning. And the had known, right, is really what functions as our subjunctive here. Okay. Um, Here's the illustration. If Farah were to change, okay, what then? So here we technically have a tag question, but were is the subjunctive. It doesn't matter that Farah is singular, and that technically, since it's singular, we would say was. That is not correct. Were is correct in this instance. So kind of paying attention to those sorts of things and knowing that if you're dealing with an if construction, there's a chance that you're dealing with a subjunctive verb, I think is useful. So if you come across these types of constructions or these types of verbs, they are called subjunctive.